Mr. President, I'm going to ask for a unanimous consent motion and reserve my remarks until after we've had a chance to address that motion, recognizing that we're dealing with some scheduling issues this evening. But I want to make sure that I reserve the right to actually make a statement about my unanimous consent request after we've had our exchange. So, as if in legislative session and notwithstanding Rule 22, I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs be discharged from further consideration of S-151 and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration, that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table. This is legislation that would address the tariffs that the President is considering.
Is there objections?
Mr. President, I object.
The objection is heard. Senator from Vermont.
Thank you, Mr. President. Like my colleague from New Hampshire, I want to make a statement after, but I want to, at the moment, accommodate the scheduling requirements of some of my other colleagues. So I want to make a unanimous consent motion, as if in legislative session, and notwithstanding Rule 22, I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Finance be discharged and the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of S-2383, that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Mr. President.
The Senator from Idaho.
Mr. President, reserving the right to object, I rise in opposition to S-2383, the Creating Access to Necessary American-Canadian Duty Adjustments Act, and S-151, the Protecting Americans from Tax Hikes on Imported Goods Act of 2025. I agree with my colleagues, who will speak in just a moment, that tariffs should be more targeted to avoid harm to small businesses. I made precisely that point at a hearing in the Finance Committee in May. Similarly, with less than 2 days to go to the August 1 reciprocal negotiation deadline, I appreciate that my colleagues, as well as our constituents, may be nervous about what comes next. However, at this juncture, these two bills are counterproductive to helping American families and businesses of all sizes. The President's historic trade negotiations are bearing fruit. President Trump already announced new trade deals with major trading partners, including the United Kingdom, Indonesia, Japan, and the European Union. I urge other trading partners to reach a deal by August 1st. Consequently, S-151 and S-2383 are counterproductive to the progress that President Trump has achieved and is poised to continue achieving in ongoing negotiations with our trading partners. On April 30, the Senate rejected the IEEPA disapproval resolution on reciprocal tariffs for the same reasons. For these reasons, I again object.
The objection is heard. The Senator from New Hampshire.
On Friday, we may be facing the next escalation in the President's trade war. The tariffs that the President announced in April on virtually every country in the world are set to go into full effect tomorrow night at 12:01 a.m. Those tariffs are expected to add about $2,400 in costs for the average household per year. That's why I introduced the Protecting Americans from Tax Hikes on Imported Goods Act. This bill states clearly that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act cannot be used to place taxes on imports. If the President needs to block a dangerous product, he still can under my legislation. But if there is a real threat, I think we'd want to stop it, not just tax it. That's what my bill does. It makes clear what the federal court has already found, that IEEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, does not authorize tariffs. Passing my bill would give businesses and families more certainty to plan for the future and to keep more of their hard-earned dollars in their pockets. Virtually every business in New Hampshire that I've visited since the president announced his proposed tariffs has said that in addition to the tariffs, the uncertainty is as difficult for them as the tariffs. So I'm disappointed that Senator Crapo decided to block this common sense legislation. Sadly, I'm not surprised. But this bill would do so much to help families and businesses in all of our states. It would shield them from higher costs. And we've been hearing about some of these deals that Senator Crapo referred to that have been reached with the EU and Japan. But let's be clear about what those deals mean, because even after those deals, those agreements, trade agreements, Americans are going to be left paying dramatically higher tariffs. A new analysis this week found that we will be paying the highest tariffs since the Great Depression. And we saw what those tariffs before the Great Depression contributed to. Now, we just saw a deal announced with the EU by the President and Ursula von der Leyen, the head of the European Commission, forcing 15% taxes on imports. Now, compare that to what we were paying in 2024 at this same time. That was about 1.5%. So under this great deal that the president negotiated with the EU, Americans are going to be paying 10 times what we paid last year. And with Japan, President Trump agreed to a 15% tax. That's also 10 times what we were paying last year. So let's don't pretend that these are some big wins. The president can announce that, but they're only a slight improvement on a crisis that the president created himself. At a time when people are rightly worried about the rising cost of living, Trump's tariffs amount to a tax to make everything from clothes to housing to food even more expensive. For example, last month, home prices hit a record high, and these tariffs could add more than $10,000 to the cost of a home. Coffee prices hit a record high earlier this year, and now President Trump wants to put a 50% tariff on Brazil, our largest source of coffee. As families do their back-to-school shopping, they're going to see higher prices for clothing and shoes. Those prices could go up by 35% by the end of the year. And for new parents, just for example, the price of one stroller at Walmart went up 50% in 2 months. And there are countless more products that are facing higher prices. So let's be clear. These tariffs do nothing to bring down costs. And in fact, they could add, as I said earlier in this statement, about $2,400 to the average household's yearly expenses. That's money that most families don't have just lying around. We have all of those costs from these tariffs, and yet at this moment, 30 hours from when the tariffs are going to go into effect, we still have seen no official notice implementing any of these deals, and that includes, by the way, no clarity on whether prescription drugs coming from Europe will face a 15% tariff starting in 2 days. I had a chance to meet with a pharmaceutical company this week, and they were lamenting what the impact was going to be on prescription drug prices because of the tariffs from the EU. Last Friday, I visited the Bruckner Group in New Hampshire. They supply equipment to domestic manufacturers and import some of their specialized machines, which they make, in Europe. The machines they bring in are sold to manufacturers here in the U.S. to make everything from IV bags to toothpaste containers. They have 80 employees in the U.S. and far more work on their machines at other companies across the country. They saw orders put on hold in April, and further investments in the U.S. are delayed because they can't be certain what the tariffs are going to be that they might face. So they told me that Even worse than the tariffs in some way is the uncertainty that's been created, the chaos that's been created by President Trump's announcements, because people don't know how to plan. Businesses don't know what to invest in. I believe in supporting domestic manufacturing. It's New Hampshire's third largest industry. But half of all imports are raw materials and intermediate goods, the very things that domestic manufacturers rely on. Instead of supporting domestic manufacturing, these trade policies are making future American manufacturing more expensive. And furthermore, they're threatening jobs. You know, my husband and I started out our married life owning and operating a small business. I know the hardest part of small businesses is growing and sustaining those businesses when you're uncertain about what's going to happen. And that's what these tariffs create, as I heard at Bruckner Group USA, as I've heard at every business I've visited. When I visited Bruckner 4 days ago, we had a 10% tax on everything imported from the EU. And at the time, that was set to jump to 30% this Friday. Then Sunday, we saw an agreement to set the tax at 15%, but with unclear exceptions to that tax, like, as I heard from the pharmaceutical company, with prescription drugs. I also heard from Flight coffee roasters in Bedford, New Hampshire. They're worried about the president's threat to place new tariffs on Brazil because they've already been paying a 10% markup on coffee because of these tariffs. Now they're facing a 50% tax on Brazilian coffee starting on Friday. And they have no choice but to charge consumers more. Their most popular product comes from Brazil. So this is a big hit to their business, and they can't be sure how this is going to impact their sales. And we should be clear, the U.S. has a trade surplus with Brazil. This threat is just because the president wants Brazil's independent judiciary to stop the prosecution of Brazil's former president. How is any business supposed to plan for that kind of rationale and for those kinds of swings? They need to secure financing, they need to place orders, they need to invest in order to grow in the months and years ahead. But building a new plant and moving production takes time. In some cases, it takes years. So how can companies plan when they don't even know whether the Trump tax, his tariff, is going to be 10% or 30% or something in between or something higher? New Hampshire's in a housing crisis. How can builders plan their costs when no one can tell them if there's going to be a new 30 or even 50% tax on their materials come Friday? And how can a family already struggling with high costs continue to pay the rent and put food on the table if their household expenses are going up $2,400 this year? And now on Friday, the administration is planning to make the goods businesses and families need 10 or 30 or 40 or 50% more expensive overnight. This president promised to lower the price of everything: groceries, rent, energy. What these tariffs do is just the opposite. And we're hearing a lot of positive spin from the administration about the deals that they're striking. But let me end by making 2 points. First, we heard a lot of talk about 90 deals in 90 days. Well, we're way past that deadline, and we've seen 6, count them, 6 announcements. And it's not even clear that Vietnam has actually agreed to what the president announced. Second, I want to remind all of us that these deals all force Americans and American businesses to pay a tax rate that is far higher than what we saw before the president engaged in this trade war. I talked earlier about how for both Europe and Japan, Americans will face a tax that's 10 times higher than we paid last year. That same trend holds across every deal he's announced. With Indonesia, he agreed to a 19% tax, 4 times what we paid last year. With the Philippines, a 20% tax, up from 1.3%, so 15 times what we paid last year. And for the UK, where we have a trade surplus, again, a trade surplus, he agreed to a 10% tariff, again, 10 times what we paid in 2024. So we should be very clear. All of these rates are an increase from what Americans have been paying since April. This president has raised average tariffs from 2.5% to more than 17%, the highest level since the Great Depression. Again and again, he is adding costs to American families and businesses. And what are these costs for? They're to finance tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans, for the biggest corporations. The end result of the president's art of the deal on trade is higher costs for families, uncertainty for businesses, and alienated allies who no longer view America as a reliable partner to do business with. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.